word relationships is at the heart of today. And as we go through the conference, please keep asking yourself, what can I do to keep growing this grassroots movement? So let's start and look at Scotland's ACES journey. And to navigate us through that journey, please welcome the wonderful Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk. Thank you.
It is fab to see all of you out there and to welcome you to this really unique event. This is the second major event that Scotland has held of this kind in less than a year. And I think it's worth starting by thinking about that. That's more than 4,000 people who have come just to this small part of the conversation that our country has decided to have. A conversation about relationships, about trauma, about adverse childhood experiences, about stress, about human development, about healing. Whatever word you want to choose, we are having new conversations. And given that today's event comes out of a vision for an ACE-aware nation, my job is to give us a bit of context. I want to take us on the history of our ACES journey. And to do that, I want to begin with a quote from Jimmy Reid, one of Scotland's greatest orators, a boy born in Govan, which is not far from here, the son of a father who worked the docks, a working-class labor activist whose funeral in 2010 was attended by good friends, including Alex Ferguson and Billy Connolly. And Jimmy Reid said, "Human beings are social beings. The challenge we face as a society is that of rooting out anything and everything that distorts and devalues human relationships." Jimmy Reid spoke those words in the 1970s when he was trying to counter the terrible economic decline of the collapse of the shipbuilding industry. And I begin with his words not only because Jimmy Reid was envisioning a future grounded in social justice, and not even because his daughter Eileen joins us in the audience today. Wherever you are, Eileen, thank you for being here. I begin with them because Jimmy Reid has been central to our country's ACES journey, even though I don't think he ever heard of them. Because our story, our ACES journey, begins in 2005, when the newly formed Violence Reduction Unit, based in Strathclyde Police, which was led by John Carnican and Karen McCluskey, and Karen will be joining us on this afternoon's panel, they began to get curious about the science of childhood trauma, and they began to take a different approach to violence, rather than seeing it simply as a criminal justice issue, an issue about bad people. They began to take a public health approach to thinking about violence. They discovered the groundbreaking Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which had been published in 1998, some years before. And they began talking about it publicly. And indeed, they would go on to invite one of its lead authors, Dr. Vincent Felitti, to come and speak at a major World Health Organization conference. But I have to say, as major as that was, it didn't have as many people as are in this room today. Now, in that same year, in 2005, something else important for our country happened. We appointed a new chief medical officer by the name of Harry Burns. And he, too, will be on the panel this afternoon. Harry also talked about the ACE study, and he talked about it again and again. He spoke to tens of thousands of people in his 9-year term as chief medical officer. And here's the link. he quoted Jimmy Reed at almost every talk he gave. And this is the emphasis that he brings to Jimmy's work. Quoting him again, Jimmy said this: alienation as the major social problem in Britain today is the cry of people who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control. Alienation is the feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel they have no say in shaping or determining their own destinies. Jimmy Reed's speech in 1972 was hailed as 40 years before its time. The New York Times described it as the greatest speech since President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Well, guess what? If that's so, then those 40 years have come to pass. And maybe we have finally arrived where Jimmy was. After our start in 2005, various public speakers, that includes myself, Tina Hendry, Alan Sinclair, and others, continued to highlight ACES, attachment, relationships, emotional self-regulation. And I think now that what we were doing was steadily tilling the cultural soil. And we were exploring creative ways that stubborn social problems could be tackled. My home city of Dundee, we have the highest rate of drug deaths in Europe. And I think we would be better placed to tackle those if we really got our heads around the intergenerational trauma that I think came from the vicious way in which we were industrialized in the 19th century. So we carry on with about a decade of soil tilling. And in 2017, something unexpected happened, and all that tilling of the soil yielded sudden fruit. The documentary film Resilience, which explores the science of ACEs, which I know many of you will have seen, dropped into that soil that had been so fertilized. And interest exploded. There were communities all over the country that wanted to screen the film, that wanted to know more about ACEs, that wanted to know what they could do to develop relationship-led practices. I think 10 or 20, maybe more than that, maybe 30,000 people. Originally, I thought I was going to measure it. I was going to keep track of it. And as interest in that film grew, I realized I had to give up that vision. I don't know how many people have seen that film. What I know is that it has had a tremendous impact on the thinking of our country. And here's the interesting thing. It wasn't promoted by a public body. That film, the interest in that film was promoted because of grassroots interest, because people asked to see it. So Scotland now, along with our friends across the borders, wants to know about this stuff. There are now local ACEs hubs across the country, put together by local community members who thought that other people who lived near them deserved to know this stuff. Last September, we had the big conference, and we invited Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. I know many of you were there. I just saw your hands. And now, 9 months on, we gather again, this time to hear from Dr. Gabor Mate. Wherever you are in this national journey, wherever you are in your personal journey, you are welcome to this conversation. Because our country is having new, inclusive conversations about childhood suffering. We're having conversations that somehow we've not quite before had the knowledge or the courage or maybe the listening skills to have. And they are hard conversations to have. We are now brave enough to look at things that are sore: childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect. Those are the things that feel sore in childhood. And we are now somehow able to have conversations that we were not quite able to have before. The ACES language links with lots of other activity going on in our country. The smacking ban, which seeks to give equal protection to children to the kind of protection that we give to adults. Looking at the age of criminal responsibility. The efforts of the care system to put love at the heart of that care system with the care review. A campaign to have a play-based stage of education so that we can have children in kindergarten rather than sitting down to formal education too early in their development. A trauma focus lets us knit together all of those diverse conversations. It lets grassroots, government, professional sectors, and communities work together in a new way because we now have a common language. It brings together issues that before we did not realize were linked. I've put my weight behind building an ACE-aware nation because I don't think a better opportunity for cultural change is going to come along in my lifetime. Okay, I'm glad you've just applauded, because here's the thing. You need to know what you think about this. You need to leave here today knowing what you think, not just what other people think. Because there's a debate now going on in our country. We weren't having that debate before, and I welcome it. We need to have that debate. So there are a number of voices who are concerned about things like the ACES model. Is that the best way to think about the issues that we're tackling? The language of ACES, the implications, should we have scoring? These are issues that we need to think about. And there are people trying to make sure that we are looking at those wider issues. But here's the thing. Although sometimes that conversation and that debate is a bit uncomfortable, we need to think about the tone in which we have that. Here's the thing. We weren't having that debate in the decade while we were tilling our soil. We are now having that debate, and I take that as a sign that our cultural ability to respond to children's distress and shame might finally really be shifting. Because look, you're all here to have a conversation, a hopeful conversation about these tough subjects. The vision of an ACE-aware nation was born out of a hope that every single citizen of Scotland, all 5 million of us, every single one, could gain a deeper appreciation of just how important relationships are for human health and happiness, especially the relationships during childhood. Today is about empowering each and every one of you to think about what you can do to spread that message and what you think about it. Because here's the bottom line. Stable, nurturing relationships need to be at the center of every policy we have in Scotland. To achieve that vision that you've just endorsed, we need the guidance of those who speak from the voice of lived experience. Without that guidance, how can we know where the gaps lie in services and in support structures and in communities? That's why the two organizations who've hosted this year's conference and last year's conference, Tigers and Connected Baby, that's why we have felt so proud and privileged to work with Kim McGuigan and James Docherty to bring today's event to fruition. This was their dream. It was their dream to invite Dr. Gabor Mate to come to Scotland to help us to think more deeply about trauma. It was their dream to invite Darren McGarvey, Scottish author and commentator, because he works bravely to try to get us to see the impacts of family chaos and poverty. So in a moment, you're going to hear direct from James and Kim. I just want to finish by one more quote from Jimmy Reed. He was trying to bring about a social transformation based in community and belonging. The year that he spoke his now famous words, in 1972, was the very same year that I, as a 9-year-old child in America, first discovered Scotland on a map of the world, and first dreamed that one day I might visit that far-off land, never imagining that I would go on to spend nearly the whole of my adult years within its shores, first as a research scientist studying infant development, and now as a public speaker trying to help others to understand what I understood. That I would be working alongside so many other voices for the same cultural movement that Jimmy Reed advocated, one grounded in our common humanity. So let me finish with a quote from him. Alienation is expressed in different ways by different people. It is to be found in our courts, described as those with criminal antisocial behavior. It is expressed by those young people who want to opt out of society, the dropouts and so-called maladjusted. It is expressed by those who seek permanent escape from the reality of society through intoxicants and narcotics. Of course, it would be wrong to say that these are the sole reason for these things. But alienation is a much greater factor in all of them than is generally recognized. Jimmy Reed was talking 50 years ago about exactly the same things that we are contemplating this very day. If we could have, we'd have invited him to this afternoon's panel. But since that isn't possible, I wanted to invoke his spirit this morning. So let's do it. Let's figure out if an understanding of trauma can finally bring about the Scotland that he was working for then, and that I believe we can have today if we are courageous enough and compassionate enough and insistent enough. Have a great day. I am so glad you are here. Thank you.